All right.
Oh,
Anyway,
you
thank
did
you
fine.
everybody for joining us for our program this evening, All Labor Has Dignity with Michael Honey, uh, which is happening in part because we are facing a extremely important battle in the legislature about whether New Hampshire will adopt legislation known as right to work. This was something that Dr. King opposed throughout his too short career, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in a little bit. Maybe we should just why don't we just get started? So I'm going to begin by introducing myself. My name is Arnie Alpert. For about 4 decades, I was associated with the New Hampshire program of the American Friends Service Committee, and I retired last year. And I now have a pension, which is in part protected by the fact that I had a strong union. I'm no longer part of Unite Here, which was the union of AFL-CIO staff, but as soon as I retired, I joined the National Writers Union. I want to give special thanks this evening to the Reverend Dr. Gail Kinney for organizing this event. I want to thank the New Hampshire program of the American Friends Service Committee for Zoom hosting, and Jason Wells of the New Hampshire Council of Churches for helping out, and thank all of you for coming. What prompted this evening's program is a coincidence between the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, which was yesterday, and a crucial vote that is coming up in the legislature on right to work, or more properly called right to work for less, virulent anti-labor legislation, which is a very serious threat this year. We are thrilled that Michael Honey has found time to talk with us about Dr. King's connection to the labor movement and why that still matters. So here's what's going to happen. Michael Honey is going to give a presentation of about 20 minutes, which he'll use some slides for, which we hope the technology will work well. And then he's going to take some questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box, which is in the lower middle part of your screen, and type in your question there. And when we get there, Jan Schaefer will go through those and come up with some questions. Your chat screen should also be available. If you're having any technical questions or anything, you can use the chat screen for that. After we've had a chance for some back and forth with Michael, we'll conclude with remarks from the Reverend Dr. Kinney and also a short comment from Glenn Brackett, the president of the New Hampshire AFL-CIO. Oh, and I need to give you a little bit of a warning. Gail is going to expect you to take action after this evening's program. So we're all going to learn a lot, but that's not the only point here. As I was thinking about this, I was reflecting back on our 20-year campaign to make Dr. King's birthday a holiday in New Hampshire. About 10 years into the campaign, our strongest opponents got clever and proposed that instead of Martin Luther King Day, that we have a holiday called Civil Rights Day, because after all, Dr. King was a civil rights leader, and that there were other civil rights leaders. From then on, and that was another decade, we argued that to understand Dr. King's distinct contribution, we could not confine him to a box labeled civil rights. That Dr. King was obviously always an advocate for civil rights and speaking out against racism, but he was always an advocate for economic justice. He was always an advocate for nuclear disarmament and peace. He was always an advocate for using nonviolence as the best way to bring about change. Well, I wish we had had Michael Honey's books already by then to help us. Here's what Michael Honey says about the importance of Dr. King's labor speeches. He says, the speeches may help people, this is 10 years ago he wrote this, so just think about that. These previously unavailable speeches may help people in the current explosion of unemployment, homelessness, hunger, poverty, and war to think anew about issues that bedevil us today. Continuing racial divisions and the politics of hate, machines and corporations taking people's jobs away, senators who filibuster to stop social progress, the waste of economic resources on failed military solutions to human problems, a widespread business-promoted culture of opposition to unions, and a mass media that fails to examine the intertwined, destructive effects of racism, poverty, and war. So who is Michael Honey, and why have we invited him here to join us? Michael is a teacher of African American and U.S. history, of civil rights and labor studies at the University of Washington at Tacoma. Before his academic career, he was the Southern Director of the National Committee Against Repressive Legislation. He has way too many honors, awards, and publications to list, but I want to mention a couple of things. He is the author of Black Workers Remember, An Oral History of Segregation, Unionism, and the Freedom Struggle, published in 1999. He is the author of an invaluable book called Going Down Jericho Road, The Memphis Strike, King's Last Campaign, published in 2007. He is the editor of All Labor Has Dignity, a collection of Dr. King's labor speeches. You can see my versions have all sorts of little tabs on them of things to remember. Michael is a producer of a documentary film called Love and Solidarity, Reverend James Lawson and Nonviolence in the Search for Workers' Rights. And we are hoping to get a hold of that and be able to play it here in New Hampshire pretty soon. So I want to introduce Michael Honey, remind you to use the Q&A for your questions, and I'll see you again in a little bit. Michael Honey, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share the screen here. So I'm going to start with this. It's this is my most recent book, To the Promised Land. And as you just heard, what I've been really specializing in is King's association and relationship to the labor movement. And until I started doing that, that was something that was basically unknown. And actually it was unknown to me. I was researching in the King papers in Atlanta for another book that I was working on. And I found a file called King's labor speeches. And it turned out to be not a file, it was a whole box. And so that's how we ended up with that book that you just saw the cover of, All Labor Has Dignity. And then that came sort of after this 10-year slog of trying to write the history of the Memphis sanitation strike. And the point of it is that what you just heard, that people used to see King as a civil rights leader. And of course, I'm sure all of you know that he was far more than that. Not putting down civil rights, but he said that the civil rights struggle was only phase one of the freedom struggle. So he said 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott, to 1965, the Selma to Montgomery campaign, which that 10-year period got us the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. He said, but all that is doing is restoring rights that we once had under the Freedom Amendments to the Constitution after the Civil War. So we're just getting something that was ours to begin with that was taken away. Now we want social and economic justice. So this last book, what I tried to do in this is to put that all together in a little more coherent way. The Going Down Jericho Road book, what that one does is tells you what happened to King at the end of his life was not some accidental thing. It wasn't just that he was killed in Memphis. There was a huge movement in Memphis that was probably just as important as the Montgomery bus boycott. And that there's a lot to understand about the linkage between labor and civil rights by understanding King's trajectory. And of course, we know and just heard about the linkage between racism, poverty, and war, which I don't know how many people saw this yesterday, but there was a remarkable reading of King's Riverside speech of April 4th, 1967. It was fantastic. Different actors and artists reading from that speech. And it's so all-encompassing, you really have to see it and to try to understand the huge framework that he was working within. So I'm going to take you through this little book as quickly as I can, and then get to the issue of right to work laws and why it's so important. So to begin with, as you can see and you can read on the screen here, King was trying to bring about a moral revolution, and that's what the Poor People's Campaign was about. The Memphis sanitation strike was about rights for working people and dignity for people at work, and the very issues that Arnie just read to you, how they're all connected in today in this crisis that we're in now. So I'm going to move you through this kind of quickly and suggest that King being killed in a sanitation strike was not some one-off accidental thing. He was a longtime labor advocate throughout his whole life. So my friend Robin Kelly says that this is an important story because it's about love in action. It's about radical hopes and the idea of transformation. And I'm going to start with this, that people don't think of this when they see King in his nice clothing and his great diction, that his grandparents were slaves and sharecroppers, and that he comes out of that whole story of slavery and then segregation in the South. He was not separated from any of this. He grew up in a neighborhood. If you ever go to Atlanta and go through his neighborhood, the poverty is still there. And so he was never really removed from this. And then when he got involved in the Montgomery bus boycott, it was putting his beliefs into action. He didn't start it, and it was accidental in the sense that he didn't go to Montgomery as a minister with any idea of starting a movement. Rosa Parks did that, and E.D. Nixon. And it's really the women of that boycott that carried it on and made it so powerful. And he was very appreciative of this. And he learned a lot about the working class movement in the Montgomery movement, that this is where the power came from. If you look at the gatherings in the churches, most of the people in the church are women, and they're singing, and they're, these are the people that ride the buses. These are the great majority of people riding the buses. So what King became was someone who could put words to action and help to interpret this to the rest of the world. And of course, they won that struggle, but not after their home, Coretta King and Martin King, their home was bombed, and he was arrested and kidnapped by the police for a short time. And other people had some terrible things. This is a really important picture. This is at Highlander Folk School, as it was called back then, in 1957. And he gave a speech there. He said, "I never intend to adjust myself to the evils of segregation and the tragic inequalities of an economic system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes." He always had what King said is a kind of a Marxist view of capitalism. Of course, he was a Christian, he was not a Marxist, but the way he looked at capitalism was from a social gospel viewpoint of the Black church. And he saw capitalism as exploitive and something that had to be controlled and reformed, and toward the end of his life, radically reformed. And of course, the first thing that happened, that he was called a communist, which is, ridiculous to think about the most famous Baptist preacher in the world being seen as a communist. But it sort of reminds us of the time that we're in today, that these same kind of things are going on. So what he was a Gandhian. He was somebody who's following the nonviolent philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. If you go to the King Center in Atlanta, you'll see the 6 principles of direct action, nonviolent direct action. And as this last 6 principles says, he got his inspiration from Jesus and his techniques from Gandhi. So I'm working on a book now about nonviolence, and my film that Arnie mentioned is about how James Lawson applied these principles. So I'll just go through this very quickly. I grew up in the Detroit area, and King came to Detroit a number of times. What I like about the pictures is it shows you how people related to Dr. King, the powerful synergy that they had. how his movement was related to the other movements. And what happened in the South was seen really as an epical struggle to overturn segregation, but it was much more. James Lawson says that every movement that we had an economic framework to it. This, of course, is the letter from the Birmingham jail. And you're probably familiar with a lot of that. You may not be familiar, though, with the Scripto Sanitation strike. He came back from Oslo, Norway, where he got the Nobel Peace Prize after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted. And the first thing he did was go on the picket line with these 800 Black women in his neighborhood where his church was, and they won that strike. And King always had this strong relationship to the working class issues of the South and of the country. And when he was in Oslo, he put this out in a very clear way. He said, there's people everywhere need to have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. And he was already talking at this time about the 3 major social evils alive in the world today: war, economic injustice, and racial injustice. And so he continued on that. And this is Selma, and this is John Lewis, of course, being beaten in Selma. This was the beginning of phase 2. Once Selma led to the Voting Rights Act, then King said the next phase is economic and social justice. This is down in Mississippi with Stokely Carmichael and other people. By 1967, he was organizing the Poor People's Campaign to try to go to Washington. This is with Joan Baez there in Mississippi. And he was great, you know, in the small gatherings in these churches all over. He was traveling about 300 days out of the year, most of his life from 1965 onward. This is where I sort of intersect with the story. This is Detroit in 1967, where we saw the urban issues in the North really as the huge challenge to the struggle in phase 2 for economic and social justice. And so I was in college when this was happening. And then in 68, the year before I graduated, this happened, the Memphis sanitation strike. The poorest of the poor, 1,300 people, all men in this workforce who I won't, if you really want to read about them, read Going Down Jericho Road or Black Workers Remember. I interviewed a lot of these workers. But it was terrible work on poverty wages. And he came to speak to help them in their strike, which had been going on for 6 weeks when he came to Memphis. And here's what he said.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. But I will rise for my right to be free.
If we are going to get equality, if we are going to get adequate wages, we are going to have to struggle for it. You know what? You may have to escalate the struggle a bit. If they keep refusing and they will not recognize the union and will not agree for the check off of the collection of dues, I tell you what you ought to do, and you're together here enough to do it. In a few days, you ought to get together and just have a general wet stoppage in the city of Memphis.
You know we're standing for our unions and we shall not be moved. You know we're standing for our unions and know that we shall not be moved, just like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. And that's why I say there ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. There ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. There ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Yeah.
So those are songs by David Sawyer and Michael Honey. The Memphis sanitation strike left a real important imprint. We lost Dr. King, but we won the strike. And it left a big imprint on American labor. When I researched these different books, what I found was a tremendous linkage that King had to unions all over the country. So that RWDSU union that's organizing in Bessemer, King spoke to their conventions repeatedly and was considered like a member of their union. Longshore Union, same thing. Packing house workers, same thing. 1199 hospital workers. King had all these relationships with labor unions. And so, you know, when we celebrate King, this is my mission in life. When we celebrate King, we need to understand his whole message. And I'll get to in a minute why that relates to the right to work issues that you're dealing with. These were the last pictures of him in Memphis. I went down to Memphis in 1970, and I'll give you a couple things on that. And right in the aftermath of all of this. And we didn't celebrate, but we commemorated April 4th all the time, every year with marches. So that's what I do on April 4th. The Poor People's Campaign did continue without King, and people see it as a failure, but from an organizing point of view, it wasn't really a failure. People had a lot of experience, and a lot of those people went on to organize for the rest of their lives. This was the 1199 hospital strike in South Carolina with Coretta King leading the way. The Great Boycott, a lot of you know that. This is Coretta King with Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, of course. And this is about the time that I got involved, was in Memphis, or in Detroit, in the anti-war movement. And that's me there occupying a building, ending up in this little jail in the South. I went down, apparently Arnie knows Frank Wilkinson. I went down south to work for the National Committee Against Repressive Legislation and the Southern Conference Educational Fund. And of course, as soon as you did that, you end up in jail. Then I moved down to Memphis, where I worked on the Free Angela Davis campaign and a lot of other campaigns around political prisoners. This guy here, if you can see the arrow, is a police agent, which he was one of our best organizers who was a police agent. So I continued doing that. This is with Ben Chavez and the Wilmington 10 in North Carolina. But then ended up going to graduate school at Howard University. This was the campaign to end apartheid in South Africa. And from there on, after about 6 years of organizing, I spent the next 10 years studying and researching, and then finally becoming a professor and continuing to do that for the rest of my life. So when I talk now, I combine the movement experience with the historical experience. And I try to bring this back to people. I go down south as often as I can. I go to Memphis quite a lot. And this was 2018, the 50-year commemoration of Dr. King being assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And tens of thousands of people came to this. And of course, you see AFSCME, State County Federation of Municipal Employees, and other unions here from all over the place. And it turned out I knew a lot of the people. They came from different parts of the country. And this is a wall now that is in Memphis. So when the George Floyd and other protests started last summer, people were carrying this message with them down there in Memphis. They had big campaigns in Memphis, just like everywhere else. And the tear gas would be rolling through, these pictures. So anyway, the message is that the struggle continues on. And I'll finish with this. This is again outside of the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. So while that's on, I'm going to just leave that on the screen and say a few words about right to work, and then we'll open it up. So this is Dr. King in 1964, who he campaigned to try to stop right to work laws in Oklahoma and other places, along with the NAACP and other civil rights groups. In our glorious fight for civil rights, we must guard against being fooled by false slogans such as right to work. This high-sounding label does not mean what it says. It's a dishonest twisting of words with the aim of making a vicious law sound like a good law. It provides no rights and no work. It's a law to rob us of our civil rights and job rights. It's supported by Southern segregationists who are trying to keep us from achieving our civil rights and our right of equal job opportunity. Its purpose is to destroy labor unions and the freedom of collective bargaining by which unions have improved wages and working conditions of everyone. Wherever these laws have been passed, wages are lower, job opportunities are fewer, and there are fewer civil rights. Many unions have proved they are friends and are trying to help improve our conditions in every way. These right-to-work segregationists, that's a phrase to remember, these right-to-work segregationists are now trying to pass this in Oklahoma. This was in '64. We do not intend to let them do this. I think they stopped that campaign. We demand this fraud be stopped. Our weapon is our vote. And then, of course, he talked about the importance of people voting and defeating this. There was a lot of literature actually during this time period about right to work laws. One other quote from him, such legislation is not intended to and cannot benefit the Negro worker. It is designed instead to worsen his lot, to make his wages lower, and to destroy the unions, which brought us a higher standard of living. So, this has been a campaign going on since the Taft-Hartley Law of 1947, which opened up this whole thing about getting rid of union shops and allowing state governments to basically outlaw the union shop or the closed shop. And then, of course, the Janus decision by the US Supreme Court now made it possible for people to do this even in places like New Hampshire, which we have a right to work law in Michigan, where I grew up, which was hard to believe because that was the land of the United Auto Workers and the NAACP and a really strong labor and civil rights coalition when I was growing up in the 60s. It's astonishing to me now that even in Michigan, they have one of these. I'll end with one positive note about this to keep in mind. I spent a semester in Norway recently before the pandemic started. And what I discovered was all public employees belong to unions, ministers belong to unions. The minister in my neighborhood belonged to 3 unions. It's a union place, and 50% of all employees belong to union. Of course, if you go to some of the other Nordic countries, you'll find even higher percentages. And then I wrote an article about this, which I can send to anybody who would like to read it. I discovered that they don't have union shops. You're not required to join a union on the job. And so I asked one of the workers where I was at an academic institute. She said, well, we would be ashamed if we didn't join the union. Our parents would shame us if we didn't join the union. We don't need somebody to make us join the union. We know that this is in our interest. So even as these right to work laws spread across the land, it doesn't mean that it's hopeless. Alabama is a right to work state. And hopefully maybe these people will vote to unionize at Amazon. So I'll stop with that, and I'll, Arnie, you can take my share.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I know I tried to type a question into the Q&A and it didn't work, so I don't know whether others have had some success with that. Jan, are you getting any questions?
No, I'm not.
So let's use the chat function, which I hope that everybody can do that. If not, we'll figure something else out. So while we're doing that, Mike, could you say a little bit about how the victory in Memphis in '68 unleashed a wave of organizing among Black public sector workers throughout the South and throughout the country?
Yeah, that victory in Memphis was crucial. Up till that point, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees had organized almost nobody in municipal employment in the South. You know, South is the hardest place to organize. And one of the reasons they put everything they had into that campaign was that they thought Memphis will make it or break it for public employee unions. And in fact, that union, Jerry Worf was the president, Bill Lucy was the organizer. They were there for the whole thing, and they really did put everything into it. And after that strike was resolved and the union solidified in Memphis, it did spread to different cities around the South. And mostly importantly is the whole country. It encouraged public employees to organize. So in that sense, it was a victory despite losing Dr. King.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, I also see the movement to privatize and the whole Janus decision as an attack on workers of color in particular, because those were in some ways the major beneficiaries of what happened after '68. So I think that's an important ingredient to add to our critique of privatization. Jan, is there a question now in the chat?
Yes, there is. There's a question from Gail Kinney, Reverend Gail Kinney. Her question is, I've heard the King right to work quotes, but not in that level of detail. Where do I find them? In your books?
I was looking through my All Labor Has Dignity book, and I think you'll find references to it, but it doesn't go into as much detail as what I just gave you. What I just gave you, I went back to my archive this morning to get more detail. And these quotes about King are from documents that I found at the King papers and in the AFL-CIO papers. So, you know, probably I should write an article about it or something. But
put it on your list of articles to write. Yeah.
So if people have questions, they should type them into the chat. I actually had a question. I know that it's often said that Dr. King became a more powerful threat to our institutions when he started to speak out about the Vietnam War. But I also wonder, the whole idea that Black workers would begin to organize in a big way and then somehow unite, the idea that unions unite workers from all walks of life, Black workers, white workers, was that also seen as a huge threat?
Yeah. Well, you know, when you get down to it, that remains the big issue of the day, you know, and if you track the right-wing trajectory of the United States, all you have to do is watch what happens with union density. When King was doing his best work, they had what they called the Negro Labor Alliance, and about 35% of workers in the US belonged to unions. And then after Ronald Reagan started the massive union busting campaigns, now it's down to less than 10%. So that was, you know, that's really one of the major things that's holding us back. And until white workers and Black workers and workers of color and women and, you know, all genders start working together in a union framework of some kind, and it doesn't even have to be a traditional union, but some way of working together for economic justice, we're going to keep suffering with a lot of the problems that we have. We have other problems like racism and sexism and, you know, all the other isms, but how do you solve those things? Somehow you've got to organize people. So I don't know if the people that would see King as a threat thought of him so much as a union leader, but workers did. And of course, after he came out against the Vietnam War so fully and fundamentally criticizing American imperialism, then he was on, you know, the hit list for so many different elements of the government and the right-wing movement in this country, which is so strong, including paramilitary. James Earl Ray, of course, you know, was an escaped convict who was a follower of George Wallace. And at that time, all you had to do was go in and buy a gun, and you didn't even have to register yourself to do it.
Well, that's in New Hampshire, Michael. That's still the case. So things haven't changed. Jan, what else have we got in the questions?
We have a question from David Blair. I understand there's a federal law that prohibits an employee being denied employment because she or he does not belong to a union. Is that correct? I can actually answer that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Unless you want to.
No, go ahead.
Go for it, Jan.
Yes, there is the National Labor Relations Act. You can't be, there isn't, closed shops which would deny employment have been illegal for quite some time. And even membership is not required. What's required is that people either become a member of the union. This is when there's a union security clause, which are not permitted in right-to-work states. You either must be a member of the union or pay a fee that covers collective bargaining. And there is another question from David Blair. If that is so, is the impact of right-to-work that a worker receives union benefits without belonging to the union?
Yes, that is the problem. And I think the right-wing and employer strategy on this is so simple. If workers are unionized, but they can receive all the benefits without paying any dues, why would they pay dues? And if they don't pay dues, how long will you have a union? So this was the key issue actually in the Memphis sanitation strike. It wasn't, they had every issue that you could imagine a worker might have, but the thing that held up making an agreement with the city was they insisted on union dues deduction from their wages. And the city said, I will never, the mayor, Henry Loeb said, I will never allow union deduction of union wages by the city. Finally, the city council did it. The mayor never did do it. But the reason was that it was crucial to have a union in Memphis. You had to have some source of funding to have organizers, to have stewards, to have an office. You know, if you don't have any funds, you can't function. And that's what it's about, essentially. And so the workers who don't join the union and do have union benefits, they're getting those benefits without paying anything, but eventually there isn't going to be a union under those circumstances.
So this is a question from Tristan Husby. What were the sources of tension between Dr. King and labor leaders? How, if they did they resolve these tensions?
Oh, that's a really good question. If you read All Labor Has Dignity, you'll find King's speech, let's see, what's the date? Before the AFL-CIO, called If the Negro Wins, Labor Wins. This is early, 1961, where he makes a very strong pitch for labor rights, our civil rights, and we have to work together. But then he gives this scorching critique of unions that at that time in their constitution prohibited blacks from being members. There were unions like that. And so there were lots of racist unions, especially building trades, railroad workers, that excluded black people. And that was one of the sources of weakness of the American labor movement, was as long as you use a union to keep people out, you are undercutting the whole framework of union organizing. And that's what happened in the skilled trades. That still hasn't been broken down very well. So yeah.
Like in your book, you also talk about the attachment of the AFL-CIO in particular at that time, or that we might call the AFL-CIA, their attachment to Cold War international policy, which King was challenging.
Yes. Yeah, and that was another source of tension. And when he came out against the war, I mean, he was against the war from the beginning. It's just that in '67, April 4th, he explained the whole thing and made it so clear what the issues were. And the AFL-CIO no longer would support him after that. They were totally at odds over that issue. He was, in All Labor Has Dignity, you'll find him giving the keynote address at the Labor for Peace conference in, I think it's September 1967. And there were these so-called left-wing unions that he was very connected with. They were the peace unions, especially.
Interesting. Good.
So this question may play into that from Keith McRae, where he asked about the relationship between Dr. King and Walter Ruther from the United Auto Workers.
Yeah, and that's a good example of the tragedy of the Vietnam War. Walter Ruther was a socialist, and he and King should have been on the same page on foreign policy. They were on the same page about economic justice. Ruther was one of the strongest supporters of the civil rights movement. But there were two things. One was that a lot of white workers in the UAW wanted to keep blacks out of the skilled labor positions, this issue we just talked about a minute ago. And the other was foreign policy. And eventually Ruther came out against the war after King died. But they had a strong a positive relationship, but there were these big tensions over those two things.
We've got time for a couple more questions.
Well, there's a question from Will Thomas. What kind of role did Dr. King play in impacting Cesar Chavez and influencing his organizing efforts in California?
Unfortunately, they never met. King sent him a telegram that was lauding his efforts in California and supporting Chavez. They just never did connect personally for no particular reason that I know of. When there was a connection was during the Poor People's Campaign. A lot of people from the Great Boycott and the Farm Workers Union did connect with the Poor People's Campaign, and particularly after Dr. King was killed, Dolores Huerta, as you saw, was involved in that. But King and Chavez didn't have really a relationship.
And then from John Bonapane, why do a number of established Republican politicians support right-to-work legislation?
They want to kill the unions because, you know, that's the whole thing about the Republican Party. They want to support big business and kill the unions. And they've been doing a pretty good job of it. And it's really killing us. You know, I mean, this is why the essential workers are having such a struggle today. They don't have unions in many cases, most cases. So, I mean, that's why I could never be a Republican, because I'm a union supporter and they are the opposite.
Well, great. And I think that Glenn and Gail may have some more to say about that in a moment. Janice, is there another question, or should we turn it over to Gail and Glenn?
I think to Gail and Glenn, there is a question about voter suppression, which came from Lindsay Dearborn, asking, can you please tell us more about your work against repressive legislation, particularly how it relates to voter suppression efforts that are going on?
Voting rights.
Oh. Well,
back in the 20th century, Mike.
Yeah. The repressive legislation, right now I'm a fellow at Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, and I'm writing a book about the campaigns against repressive legislation that I was part of, which included the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Eastland Committee, various committees trying to repress social movements. Nixon's Senate Bill 1, which would have basically outlawed your First Amendment rights. John Mitchell, the Attorney General, the attacks on the Black Panther Party, on Angela Davis, and on, you know. So I did that from 70 to 76, where we constantly, somebody was always getting killed by the police, by the FBI. You probably know the Fred Hampton story, where the FBI set him up and basically Chicago police assassinated him. So that's a little bit of I think of it as another untold story. So that's why I'm writing about that now. And, you know, we actually made some progress in the sense that we stopped a lot of those repressive laws. We got rid of HUAC. We got rid of Richard Nixon. I mean, that was the turning point. I thought King wrote in Look magazine on April 16th, 1968, posthumously, that he was afraid the US was headed toward fascism through racism. And he was thinking of George Wallace, and he was thinking of Richard Nixon and the right-wing movement in the United States. And he was thinking of these repressive laws also. We had the detention camp provisions of the McCarran Act. They actually had concentration camps in America for movement people. We didn't get to that point, but so it was kind of turned back for a while, and we had the church committee, and we had you know, a lot of reforms after Watergate. So now we're kind of back to struggling with a lot of that again, and partly because the Supreme Court is so horrible now. But I think that it's still possible to stop those things, and just takes a huge mass movement to do it.
Great. Absolutely. Well, that's what we're
There's
Jan?
one more thing, Arnie, which is Dan Justice, and I think this is a good thing to maybe close out the questions with, which is asking you about the PRO Act, which would repeal right to work nationwide, one of the many things it would do, and is currently making its way through the House, through Congress, which is major labor law reform.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so encouraging. I was the president of the Labor and Working Class History Association during the Obama period, and we were trying to get the Employee Free Choice Act passed.
Right.
And it did some of the things. The PRO Act is better, but the Employee Free Choice Act did some of the things that the PRO Act would do to, essentially you've got the Wagner Act that says that you have the right to organize and the employer is supposed to remain neutral, which is a joke. I mean, employers are anything but neutral. You can see that with Amazon in what's going on in Alabama. They are not neutral. They are cornering their workers and scaring them and telling them how, they should vote. That's all against the Wagner Act. So obviously those provisions of the Wagner Act need to be reinforced in a really, really big way. Under the Obama administration, they never moved on the Employee Free Choice Act. They didn't do much about it at all. So I'm really encouraged that now the Democrats and Biden are openly pro-union. Hooray! I don't know where it's going to go, but it's about time, that they started doing that, and that's the only way we're going to get ahead.